Einstein, get money.
Money at my motherfucking mouth. A mansion, a ranch, and a camp in a town. A motherfucking store with the floor made of scalps. Bobby from the block don't got rocks, he got outs. Get money.
Money in a motherfucking jar. Shark fin pastry, summers on Mars. 20 motherfuckers in a levitating car. 747 full of women and cigars. Get money.
Money in a motherfucking pot. A castle full of cars and a yard full of yachts. Get money.
Money, 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 motherfucker. Money, 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 motherfucker. Money is a motherfucking joke. 40 bald eagles sewn into a coat. Get money, 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 motherfucker. Zoo with the crib, mermaid in the moat.
How's it going, guys, and welcome back to another build video, this one on my Zone Zane build, a clone Zone Zane build focused on autonomous damage through various sources. This may sound like quite the brain off, barely any actual gameplay build, and yeah, it kind of is, but I find it to be quite effective, weirdly fun, and definitely a bit more unique of a playstyle for Zane. But let's get on into things here, starting out with our blue tree. Of course, as I mentioned, we're using Sentinel with the Winter's Drone and the Boomsday Augment. Now, Winter's Drone is unnecessary, however, converting drone's damage to cryo damage lets us scale it with cryo damage bonuses. So this just lets us get a little bit more damage out of drone potentially, while also letting it freeze things for us, still acting as some quite good utility, but this isn't really necessary, and you could instead go for bad dose or static field. We then also use Boomsday for a very similar reason, allowing drone to fire out a rocket that deals splash damage every couple of shots, and this again just lets us scale the damage a little harder through splash damage bonuses. Now, many people see drone either as useless, usually those are people who haven't experimented with drone too much, or as pure utility. However, drone in its base form does actually output some decent damage, and as you scale drone to the level that you'll see in this video, while it's not gonna be solo clearing Molly 1 takedown, it does actually solo kill enemies, and quite effectively at that. So don't be fooled, this is actually doing a lot of our damage. The only augment I really wouldn't recommend though is Almighty Ordnance. While this is a damage augment, it's just kind of shit. Not only is it just not great damage and very inconsistent damage, but you only get one activation of this per activation of drone, and we're playing Zane. Drone is active for a very, very long time, meaning that you pretty much only get one cast of Almighty Ordnance, a pretty shit still, every couple of minutes. But onto the actual tree, we have a pretty standard tree. Violent speed and violent momentum, of course. 5 points and a cool hand for some reload speed. This is actually very important to max, as since we are using Teediors, this will let us chuck them even faster. A point into drone delivery, seeing red, and salvation, of course. You only need 1 point in salvation, as at endgame you're dealing more than enough damage that 3% lifesteal will take you all the way up to full. Where things can get a little bit weird is I'm actually not putting any points into playing dirty, just because our damage really isn't important here, and while you could dump some points into this to get a little bit more damage out of Zane, it would of course be active, and playing dirty is a very good still. I find it's just way more worthwhile to put those points into violent violence. We are using a dark army, which we'll get to a little bit later, but you do need to empty a magazine of a dark army to have it at its most effective, so being able to do that quicker with a lot of fire rate is very important. And then I just dump the last 2 points into Good Misfortune and get down to Death Follows Close. Now coming to our second biggest tree, our orange tree. Of course we've got Digi-clone, running with the augment Schadenfreude, as this lets us keep our shield up a little bit better. It's also very nice as we are using a low level revolter, so this helps us keep that active significantly better. We'll talk more about that when I actually get to the revolter. And Doppelbanger, pretty much just because this lets us end our action still early and is very good for repositioning clone without having to teleport back to it. The rest of the augments won't really give us too much value. Now once again, we have a pretty standard tree here. Prime Unitus is very strong. Again, a bit of an inverse synergy with the Dark Army, however, I think it's worthwhile to pick up, as it just gives us more damage with other Teediors that we might use. 5 points into Borrowed Time just to keep our action stills up a little bit more. Donnybrook for some health regen and some damage for clone. 1 point Duct Tape mod not only to help us move further along, but also for that self-splash damage immunity. Quick Breather gives us quite a lot for this build. Of course, it helps us keep clone alive a little bit better by healing him every time we teleport to him. But again, having Zane instantly begin to recharge his shields upon swamping is very strong for our revolter interactions. 1 point OG just kind of as a quality of life thing. I don't find myself going down too much with this build, and if I do, it's often better to just let clones stay alive to kill something else. But if you find yourself in a bad situation, OG can come in quite handy. 3 point Supersonic Man, more movement speed while our action stills are active. Then we take Boom Enhance just to super buff up our Digi-clone in just about every single way. Of course, this takes grenades, which is why I put 2 points in a pocket full of grenades just to make sure that we're always topped up. And then where I deviate from my usual clone build trees is Trick of the Light, as Trick of the Light actually does apply to drone, and it is always active on drone, which getting an additional 45% damage bonus bonus on top of drone is incredibly nice and helps with its damage a hell of a lot. And finally, of course, double barrel, very important to pick up, as we do definitely want control over what guns clone holds. And finally, we put the last of our points into purple. There's honestly no good place to put them, and purple just kind of ends up being the best. All three of the tier 1 stills are pretty bad, so I just dump them into mana focus, but really you could put them anywhere, but I just find that Renegade doesn't really do a hell of a lot, and Deja Vu also won't do a hell of a lot for the guns that we're using, but also if it does anything, it's going to be negative because it's going to delay a reload. So 5 points mana focus just kind of to move down, and I suppose it does give us a bit of accuracy when we first activate our action stills. Headsman's Hand for some crit damage, Commitment for a very minimal bonus to gun damage, but also for that cooldown rate, very nice to get our shit back up quickly. Fugitive just to let us run and gun, and the last 2 points I just dump into Domino Effect for some more reload speed and fire rate. Now talking about our gear, of course the star of the show here is the Dark Army, as when the Dark Army is in you or your clone's hands, it'll summon these 3 drones that will fire at enemies. Reloading the Dark Army with an empty magazine will drastically increase the damage that those drones deal, and making it elemental, meaning that they will do some insane damage with Zane's equipped Dark Army, but even more on your clone as they get that clone scaling. This is also one of the few Tediors that clone will actually interact favorably with, as you will actually properly empty the magazine before reloading, which usually you don't want to do with Tediors. And it is also worth noting, at least on your Cryo Dark Army, which you should probably have a Dark Army of each element, but you do want the standard reload that just explodes on impact over the homing reload, since it'll let you throw it at your feet to strip your shield, as the elemental effect of your self-splash damage will actually go through Duct Tape mod, and is enough to strip your shield, but since Cryo doesn't actually have a damage over time effect tied to it, it won't kill you. It can be a little more dangerous to do that with the other elements, so I would just stick to a Cryo one for shield stripping. Stripping your own shield also isn't necessary, however there are some times where you might go a little bit without an enemy hitting you, just because there's a lot of things for them to be looking at, so sometimes it can be nice to do. Though this is the main gun that I use a majority of the time, I do have a couple other options. The Bright Side is another very fun one, also fitting the theme of drones, since when you chuck it, it'll explode into 4 little drones that will fire at enemies. And the Baby Maker is another favorite, specifically with the homing reload, as it'll fire at enemies as it homes in on them. This is also one of the better options for bossing, though honestly just a Dark Army can actually do that decently well as well. There are a couple other options though, but really any Tedior will work pretty well with this build. I even had some success using the Mother 2, surprisingly enough. Not that it's amazing, but it's definitely good enough to use on this build. But the final thing I would recommend having on you is of course a Guardian Angel, as this is pretty necessary for some of the tougher bosses. It's not necessary a majority of the time, but keeping one in your back pocket can be nice. And as for the anointment that I use on all of my guns, it is just Sentinel Cryo, as it is a constant 100% bonus cryo damage source, and this will actually apply to all of the chucks of these Tediors. But moving to our actual gear, we'll start of course with the Revolter, which very importantly is a level 1, not only because this does just let us use Sentinel move speed, which not only is just a nice anointment to have, but it's kind of the best anointment for this setup. Since we are using 2 active action stills, we can't really make good use of anything that would be tied to action still end. It also means we can't really use Ass Break because that would only activate on the first activation of our action stills. So it is good that we have a good option here to use for our anointment, but it's also kind of our only option. But the thing to keep in mind that makes the Revolter especially broken is that it does not need a full recharge before it'll enrage you again. You could recharge a single point of shield, and when that shield breaks again, you will immediately refresh your shock and rage. This is why I mentioned Schadenfreude and Quick Breather as being very strong with this synergy, because you can swamp with your clone and then immediately get your shield broken and immediately refresh your enrage. Now the final thing worth keeping in mind is that while the Revolter is a global element and does apply to drone, your Revolter will not apply to Digi-clone. He gets his own specific copy of a Revolter, and when his shield breaks is when he will then become shock and rage. So he will also get the bonus of it, but it just also has to be his shield specifically that is broken. For a grenade, there's a couple different options here. I like using a level 1 It's Piss, as this will just debuff enemies when it drops out of your drone, but you could also use a couple hexes if you just wanted more damage out of it. A cryo one would be really good for freezing more enemies, with a radiation one being nice for radiation explosions, or you could also just use a mesmer for some crowd control, but I mostly stick with the piss. But the most important thing is that you have the action still active. Grenade damage is increased by 150% anointment, as this will apply to all of your Tediors, including the ones that we're using that don't really explode but just shoot at enemies. This is an incredibly strong still, as it is almost always active for us. Now for a relic, you do actually have two options here. The TDR Accompaniment can be very nice, but it isn't always the best, especially when you're using the Dark Army. For any other TDR, having mag size and reload speed is incredibly nice and will scale your damage super high. But with the Dark Army, it's a bit of an inverse synergy, as it does give you way more mag size, meaning it takes longer to get those reloads out and gives you less uptime on your actual effect. When you're using the Dark Army a majority of the time, it is far better to just default to an Icebreaker Victory Rush. Since we do have a lot of cryo damage between our Cryo Dark Army and our Winter's Drone Augment, we are freezing enemies pretty damn often, and the Icebreaker Victory Rush is not only V1 and V2 damage, both of which are very good as they're multiplicative with a majority of Zane's damage, but they also apply to pretty much everything, including his action skills. So most of the time, at least with how I play this build, I am running an Icebreaker Victory Rush, and will swap over to Accompaniment for bossing if I'm using a Baby Maker or something. And of course, splash damage and cryo damage, or really any other elemental damage type, as long as you're dealing it, are incredibly good passive rolls to get here. And finally, the class mod that we're running is the Conductor, giving us up to 50% bonus shock damage based on the remaining duration of our action skills, stacking up to a max of 100% if both of them are active and full. This shock damage is global and will apply to both your drone and your clone, along with of course yourself and your TDRs, making it quite good for our uses here. Ideally you want as many points as you can into borrowed time, but a couple into good misfortune also can't hurt. The only one you kind of don't want is adrenaline, which unfortunately is where 3 of my points are here, but I've got really good passes with that SMG damage and that action still damage, which getting action still damage is probably the most important thing on your Conductor, because since Zane doesn't really have any other source of just raw action still damage, this is an incredibly strong bonus. But that's gonna about do it for my Drone Zone Zane build, which is definitely a bit more of a goofy build, but I've been having a hell of a lot of fun with it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, all of that. Down in the description will be a link to my Twitch channel where I'll be live right after this video goes up, and just below that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.